So, Kitty and I, we are ready to talk about how bad the 2023 global recession can potentially be. GDP to fall as energy and food prices are damaging the global economy outlook, at least. But first of all, I want to welcome you to Investors Reality. And in today's video, I want to talk about the outlook for the global economy in 2023. As you might know, many investors and analysts have been forecasting the potential for a global recession. So are we all facing the prospect of 2023 being miserable and a global recession being inevitable? Or is there a chance that as the interest rate increases start to feed through, that we will see inflation coming back down and everything might just go back to normal? And therefore we can avoid some form of hard landing. Well, we're going to look at that. What I want to do today is share with you the latest forecasts that have come out from the IMF. And we're going to be looking at some data. We're going to be looking at some individual countries around the world and regions. And then let's look at some growth forecasts for all of these different areas. Then we'll go through some data on the latest global indicators. We'll talk about what's happening with the monetary policy, inflation, interest rates, and then we'll have a look at the statistics and the forecasts for all of the major economies around the world. First of all, let's talk about the commodity prices. And that is, I guess, one of the main reasons that there's so much concern about a global recession could occur right now. And that is because following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have been seeing huge spikes in the price of energy products and food for that matter. And that has caused major problems in many countries around the world. And the globe is still trying to shake off all of those problems. So in this graph, which dates back to January 2019, it shows the scale of the problem. And what you can see here is the movements in the prices of three key commodities: Brent, crude oil, natural gas, and wheat. Now the blue line shows what happened to natural gas prices over the last 3 years. And you can see that in 2019, natural gas prices were actually declining. And that decline continued through the until the middle of 2020, when the COVID pandemic had taken hold. And from that point onwards, we started to see increases in natural gas prices. However, those price increases took off dramatically following Russia's invasion. And prices, they have remained high throughout the whole of the war and are forecast to continue staying high all the way through to the end of 2023. And the reason for that is that most of Europe is dependent upon natural gas. You see, the European power industry built lots of power stations that needed and still need natural gas as the raw energy supply. And obviously the main supply of that gas over the last 10 years have been Russia, because they are the largest exporter of gas, and they have been building pipelines which could supply all of these countries directly. So this was, in fact, a very nice arrangement, both for the European countries and also for Russia. Win-win. Now, what's happened since the war started is that all of the European countries have made some kind of commitment to stop buying Russian gas. Now, some of them actually stopped because they either had their supplies cut off by Russia, or they made that conscious, decision not to buy any more gas from Russia. But for the rest of the countries, they're in the process of transition. They're moving away from Russian gas, but the problem is that many countries don't have an easy way to find alternative piped gas, and therefore they're having to buy liquefied natural gas. And that involves heavy investments into all of the infrastructure needed to convert the LNG back into natural gas. And so the price of gas globally has gone up dramatically, and it is likely to stay high for at least the next 12 months. Now the red line on this graph shows the movements in crude oil prices and follows a very similar pattern. So you can see that in 2019 oil prices, they were broadly flat as we went into the pandemic and global demand slowed down. Oil prices actually fell. However, as we came out of the pandemic, oil prices started to rise, and then we saw a spike following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, prices have started to come back down as a result of the slowdown in global demand caused by the potential global recession. So when you look at the overall picture, oil prices are still higher than they were this time last year or this time the year before. And those high prices are putting pressure on the global economy. And the yellow line shows the movements in wheat prices. You can see that up until the middle of 2020, wheat prices were broadly flat. However, as demand started to increase when we came out of the pandemic, wheat prices started to increase, and there was a real jump in prices after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, prices, they have leveled off just a little bit, but they are, unfortunately, still significantly higher than they were this time last year. And that's a major problem for a lot of people around the world, because wheat is a very basic food substance. It's used to produce flour, which is used to make bread, pasta, noodles. I think you get the point, and so on and so on. And those food types, they make up a huge percentage of a lot of people's diets all around the world. And the poorest members of society, they simply cannot afford a big increase in prices. They don't have the spare disposable income. They don't have savings. So when you get an even, or let's say small or big, or even a 5% increase in food prices, it causes real problems. But over the course of the last 8 months, we've seen a massive increase in wheat prices, and that is causing a food crisis all around the world. So how about the global inflation? Now, the direct impact of the increase in food and energy prices since the start of the Ukraine war has been that inflation has spiked in many countries around the world. And this chart shows an aggregated view of inflation over the last 22 years. And what this chart shows is that, broadly speaking, in the period between 2000 and 2022, the average rate, or 2021, the average rate of inflation across the world was around 3%. Now, obviously, there were some small fluctuations or small changes, but it was all around those levels. Now, the main change historically was back in 2008 when we had the global financial crisis. And what you can see on this chart is that the average rates at that time did increase quite significantly and rose to around 4.5%. So that actually represented a 50% increase on the long-term average. But if we look at what's happened over the course of the last 18 months, you can see and understand why economists are very concerned about the global economy, because there has been a dramatic increase in average inflation rates. And this is by far the biggest movement the world has seen any time over the course of the last 22 years. And I would like to remind you that inflation isn't 100% contributed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You see, we started to see inflation increasing all around the world due to the fact that demand outstripped supply for most goods. A lot of countries, they operated strict COVID lockdown policies during 2020, and all of those policies started to be released. There was a lot of new demand. So what I'm saying is, after the COVID lockdowns and we could go out again, all of a sudden there was a huge demand. People wanted to go out, they wanted to buy things, they wanted to do things. But what we saw was a combination of a boom in demand and shortages of products, because a lot of companies that actually closed down their facilities, so they didn't have any stock to be able to sell into the markets, and that has forced prices up. And at the start of 2022, that was the key issue for a lot of countries to bring inflation back under control. But unfortunately, we had the war. Russia invaded Ukraine. We saw a huge increase in energy costs and food costs and commodity costs. So that meant that inflation went even higher. And as you can see from this chart, our inflation was pushed to record levels, and that is what is causing major concerns. Let's move on to monetary policies. You see, monetary policy is the term that is used to describe the mechanism used by central banks in order to control their economies. So if you got an economy that you want to try to grow, you will generally look to stimulate the economy, firstly by using what's called quantitative easing. And that describes the situation where the central banks buy bonds. So what they will do is they'll go into the market, they'll buy government securities in exchange for cash. And the institutions who are selling those bonds will then use that cash to create more loans. And those loans will help people to finance things and to spend more money. And it expands the money supply and therefore should help to grow the economy. And the other way of trying to stimulate an economy is to encourage people to spend more. That is by reducing the interest rates. Because firstly, reduced interest rates means that people don't want to hold their money in the bank because they're not getting paid much interest on it. So therefore, they'd rather spend it. But secondly, and this is more important, the cost of borrowing goes down. So anybody who was thinking about moving house or buying a car or taking a loan for any purpose at all may think, well, actually the rates are so low that I think I will do that now. So they will take the money from the bank, they'll spend it in the economy, and that obviously helps to grow GDP. And both of those policies have been pursued by many countries over the last couple of years, particularly because of the COVID pandemic. So as we came out of the lockdowns, a lot of central banks, they were concerned that the economies were going into recession, and they wanted to stimulate that demand, stimulate spending, get people to go out and spend more money and get the economy to grow. But one of the problems with quantitative easing and reducing the interest rates is that it often leads to high inflation. And that is exactly what happened over the course of the past 18 months. And the situation, as we have been discussing, regarding Russia and Ukraine, has just made everything worse. So as it sits right now, if inflation is the number one issue for a lot of central banks. And so what they're doing right now is the opposite of quantitative easing. So they're actually reversing their previously quantitative easing policies, which is called quantitative tightening. So rather than buying bonds, they're selling bonds into the market. And selling those bonds means that they're taking cash from the financial institutions, which means the money supply is going to reduce. And at the same time as they're doing that, they're also increasing interest rates. Because when you increase interest rates, well, firstly, it encourages people to save because they're getting paid more for leaving their money in the bank. But secondly, and this is also more important, is that it increases the cost of borrowing. So it kind of puts people off from taking that extra mortgage, that extra loan, buying that new extra car, and all of those things. So by doing that, it should reduce demand. And when demand falls, as you might know, prices should come down. So this chart shows the monetary policy cycle for the G20 economies. So that's the 20 largest economies in the world. Now, if you follow this channel, you know that we talk about geopolitics and the G20 and also the BRIC countries quite a lot. The biggest economy in the world is the United States, followed by China, Japan, Germany, UK, and alongside North America and Europe. There are obviously other countries such as Australia and Brazil, Indonesia, Korea, Russia, Saudi Arabia that make up the mix. So as you can see, this chart dates back to 2007, which is the year before the global financial mortgage crisis. And it shows whether or not the G20 has been following an expansionary policy. So quantitative easing and those periods are represented by cuts in interest rates and policies, and as shown here in blue, below the zero line. Or if they've been following a tightening policy, which is when rates are increased and are shown in orange and red here above the zero line. So what this chart shows is that in 2007, as we go to the top of the market, the G20 had started introducing tightening policies. So that means that they were increasing rates. However, as soon as the global financial crisis hit and caused a major recession, everything went into the opposite direction. And we saw a huge amount of quantitative easing in order to try to get all of those economies growing again. And as you can see from the length of the blue lines, that there was a significant amount of quantitative easing done at the time. And as we move forward into 2009, the world started to recover and those policies were reversed. So the G20 then started to increase rates again. between 2010 and 2018. So there was a mixture of tightening and quantitative easing depending on what was happening on an annual basis. And that is fairly normal for the global economy because you will always have periods of growth followed by periods of slowdown. So it's fairly common to move between a period of increasing rates into reducing rates and so on. But now if we look at what happened from 2018 onwards, there was a general slowdown in the global economy that year. So the G20 moved into a period where it was reducing rates. And of course, that was then speeded up by the COVID-19 pandemic. And during that period, many countries around the world reduced their interest rates to virtually zero. And then as we came out of the COVID pandemic, demand started to increase, inflation started to rise, and we saw a lot of G20 changing the quantitative easing programs. So there weren't really anybody raising interest rate, but they did change their bond strategies. So if we look at what happened over the course of the last 6 months, we can see that there's been a material change. So most of the G20 countries, they are now focused on tightening their policies on bringing down inflation. The only country that's the exception to the rule is Turkey. And if you've actually watched some of my previous videos, I think you are aware that Turkey decided that they didn't agree with the traditional theory that when you have high inflation, you should increase interest rates. So what they did is that they've been reducing their interest rates for the past 18 months or so. And that has led to inflation that is going above 85% in Turkey. So it hasn't really worked very well for them, but for everybody else. So you see, all of the other countries in the G20, they're now focused on bringing down inflation, and that means that they're increasing interest rates. So let's look at the interest rates. And you can see that this chart, which dates back to the start of 2019, shows what's been happening with the rates. And this chart is kind of plotting the relative movements. So the zero line across the top would mean no relative change in interest rates. It doesn't mean that interest rates are zero, but no relative change. And in line with what we've just discussed, you can see that for the United States, which is shown in blue, the European area, which is shown in red, the United Kingdom in green, and Canada in gray. There was a significant reduction in interest rates during 2020 as the COVID pandemic took hold. And over the course of the last 6 months or so, we've seen a significant increase in interest rates in all of these economies. The only country that has a different trend here is Japan. And the movements in interest rates in Japan are shown here by the yellow line. It does stand out a little, mainly because Japan has had a deflationary problem. And they have a lot of deflationary problems in the past. So its prices haven't been increasing dramatically. And it's only been the last few months that we've started to see the impact feeding through in Japan and that there has been a change in rates. Let's have a look at the GDP forecast from the IMF. And you can see that this table shows the actual GDP growth for 2021 and the forecast levels for 2022 and 2023. And these forecasts, they have been revised as of October 2022. So these are the latest forecasts. You can see that in 2021, the United States achieved growth of 5.7%. And it is estimated that growth in 2022 will slow down to 1.6%. And that 2023 growth will be merely 1%. So this does represent a major slowdown in the United States. And if we look at the same figures for Europe, you can see that Europe achieved 5.2% growth in 2021. Growth in 2022 is forecast to be 3.1% and only 0.5% in 2023. And when you look at the breakdown of the countries that contribute to the euro area, you can see that 2 of those are actually forecast to have negative growth in 2023. Germany is forecasting 0.3 contraction, and Italy's GDP is expected to reduce by 0.2%. And these are the 2 countries that are the most heavily affected by the supply of natural gas from Russia. Both of them have built up large infrastructure that depends upon Russian gas. So they are currently in the process of stopping to buy gas from Russia, changing into LNG. And that is obviously putting a lot of pressure on the economy because there are huge costs associated with this. So we are seeing a slowdown for all of the countries in Europe in 2023, but these two major countries of the European Union have been impacted the most. Now, if we look at the United Kingdom, which is no longer part of the European Union, following the Brexit in 2021, growth was 7.4%, and in 2022 it's forecast to be 3.6%. So less than half of what it achieved in 2021. And in 2023, growth is forecast to be 0.3%. Now, I obviously do not know whether or not these forecasts are going to be 100% accurate, and they mostly are never accurate when it comes to IMF and World Bank and so on. But if we now look at United Kingdom, recently the Bank of England came out and stated that the UK is likely to go into recession and that recession could last for 2 years. So the forecast from the Bank of England, they are more pessimistic than what we are seeing here from the IMF. Usually they're all wrong, so we're probably going to see much worse. But now let's move on to China, India, and Russia. Let's start off with 2021. We can see that China achieved 8.1% growth, which is one of the highest figures on this chart. But it is also a fast developing economy. It is growing very quick. Now the growth is now forecast to reduce to 3.2% in 2022. And that means that the forecast growth is significantly less than half of what it was in 2021. And that is obviously also a major problem for a fast growing economy like China. And in 2023, it's expected that there will be an element of recovery, but growth will still only be 4.4%. So still around about 50% of what we saw China achieving in 2021. So this is obviously a setback for the Chinese economy. Now, if you look at the situation with India, actually growth was 8.7% in 21. It's forecast to reduce to 6.8% in 2022 and reduce further to 6.1% in 2023. So again, for a fastly growing economy, these figures are lower than everybody was expecting. Now, if we have a look at the situation for Russia in 2021, Russia achieved 4.7% growth. But the latest forecast for 2022 is a reduction in GDP of 3.4%, and it's expected there will be further reduction of 2.3% in 2023. So, when now it comes to Russia, these figures are based on the figures that Russia themselves have supplied the IMF. Now, the reason I'm pointing that out regarding Russia is because, it's sometimes hard to believe Western media, propaganda here and propaganda there as well. Some say the Russian economy has been very bad affected by the war, the invasion of Ukraine, and some say that it has actually helped the economy and they have found huge demand in the BRIC countries. Anyway, I guess that remains to be seen. So let's have a global GDP summary. And that's going to be on an aggregated basis. So you can see from this chart in 2021 that emerging and developing countries achieved 6.6% growth, and that's been forecast to reduce to 3.7% in both 2022 and 2023. So obviously this is a material slowdown for all of these economies because these economies are meant to be growing quickly at a rapid rate from 5 to 10% every year. Or let's say it's not uncommon for these sort of economies. So 3.7% is very, let's say, almost pessimistic. It does represent a major global slowdown. And if we look at the situation for the advanced economies in 2021, they achieved 5.2% growth. And that's expected to fall by more than 50% to 2.4% in 22 and fall by more than 50% again in 2023 to 1.1%. So you can see clearly here the global slowdown that's expected to take place over the course of the next 12 months. And if we now look at the global position in 2021, the world achieved a 6% growth in GDP. However, that growth is forecast to fall to 3.2% in 2022 and 2.7% in 2023. So let's look at the summary and perhaps a conclusion. And it certainly looks like 2023 could be a fairly grim year all across the globe. And really what I wanted to do with this video was to try to give you a complete outlook, give you some global fundamental macro data from a professional institution like the IMF that actually always gets it wrong. Now, I would always say that usually what happens with IMF projections is that they're always wrong and mostly to the downside. So probably it's going to be worse than what they predict. But what we've seen today basically is that over the course of the past 18 months, problems they have really started to appear all across the globe. But those problems, they have been heightened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because what we saw after that was obviously spike in prices. And we have also seen some major problems in the global supply chains. So we are seeing a lot of countries having to change the way that they're doing things. And all of that is obviously adding more costs to the economies. And we're also starting to see this pain feeding through even to, the little people like you and me. And on top of that, we are seeing global demand starting to reduce. And that reduced demand is now causing a lot of economies to go backwards. So it isn't just contained to what is happening in Europe. No, this is all across the world right now. And the world economy is truly facing some problems, big problems. But firstly, we got high levels of inflation. And that's a problem because nobody wants to have runaway prices, because obviously it impacts the cost of living and the standard of living. So the main way of dealing with this is to hike interest rates if we follow the traditional way of the fake monetary systems. However, it is to rack them up and stop everybody spending, actually also contracting the money supply in order to bring prices back down. But obviously the problem that we have now is that there's a global slowdown going on. So if you keep on raising interest rates, now that's going to make the situation worse because people have less money and they will spend less money. And so the slowdown starts to pick up pace. But if you don't increase those interest rates, then what's going to happen with the prices? Will prices ever come back down if you leave interest rates where they are? Well, some say that eventually prices will come back down if we go into a recession. Because by definition, a recession means that there's less spending in the economy and therefore there's less demand and therefore prices will eventually hit those levels that everybody wants. So if we think that we are facing a period now over the next 3 to 6 months, definitely, possibly even in the next 9 months, with a slowdown that's being caused by the recession, and that it won't be quick enough in order to bring prices back down, because a lot of those prices, they are being influenced by what's happening in Ukraine and the global macro issues. So high oil prices and high food prices are being caused by global demand and supply, and not what's happening on an individual country level. So there is a very real possibility that over the course of the next year, we might have a combination of high interest rates, high inflation, and a recession. And that's not really much fun for anybody, because it's going to mean that we got less money, but that things are still really expensive. And in normal circumstances, the world economy would find its equilibrium, and then we could start rebuilding. But the main, problem is that we have right now is that Russia is still involved in a conflict, and we don't know how it's going to end. The war is still going on. And obviously, as long as the war continues, we're going to have a lot of volatility. We're also going to have issues when it comes to global supplies, and that will therefore continue to see high prices. So we do have problems if the war is going to carry on for the entire 2023. It would make the recession worse. It could mean that prices stay higher for the longer, and it could mean more misery and more pain for everybody around the world. Not just the people in Ukraine, who are obviously having the worst time ever. Those who are left. Now, I still think that 2023 has the possibility to be perhaps one of the worst economic environments that we have seen for the past 20 years around the world. Having said that, if you follow this channel, you know that I do think that the traditional economies, the traditional monetary system is bound to implode. But fear not, because the future of finance is being built right in front of our eyes, and it's being built on the blockchain, and mainly on Ethereum. I welcome you to come and join all our live streams so that you can educate yourself about the Web 3.0 and the future of finance. My name is Nico Harachi, and I am number 1.